Picture this. It's the autumn of 1982, deep in the heart of Europe. The Cold War is at its height. American, British, German, and other NATO forces have gathered in a remote military training ground for one of the most ambitious exercises of the decade. The forests are alive with the roar of engines. The ground trembles beneath the heavy tracks of tanks, and the air vibrates with the thunder of helicopters. Radios crackle with coded chatter, officers bark orders, and soldiers march in unison beneath a gray sky that seems to hang heavy with tension. Among the thousands of men and women participating in this massive drill, there are 5 soldiers, ordinary young men, barely out of their teens. They laugh with each other as they check their gear, share cigarettes before patrols, and scribble quick notes in small, worn notebooks to be sent home once the exercise is over. They are not famous. They are not high-ranking officers. They are just 5 human beings swallowed into the machinery of the Cold War. But by the end of that week, these 5 soldiers will vanish without a trace. Their rifles will be found stacked neatly near a tree line. Their helmets will lie in the dirt as if dropped in haste. Their radios will still be tuned to NATO frequencies, hissing with static. But the men themselves will never return to camp. And here's the most chilling part. Hundreds of fellow soldiers, officers, and observers were present that night. Yet no one, not one single witness, saw those men leave. One moment they were there, standing watch at the edge of the forest. The next they were gone. This is not the story of a single man getting lost in the woods. It's not even the story of desertion. This is something else, something darker. For 40 years, their families would be left in silence, with nothing but vague statements, sealed records, and rumors whispered in barracks and villages near the training ground. Until finally, decades later, CIA files would begin to crack open, revealing fragments of a truth no one was ever meant to know before. We dive deeper into this mystery. If you love exploring hidden truths and forgotten stories, hit that like button and subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Where are you listening from tonight? I find it incredible that we're exploring these mysteries together across time and space, bound by a shared curiosity about the past. Because what you're about to hear isn't just a story about missing soldiers. It's a story about the Cold War's most terrifying shadows, about secrets buried beneath forests and concrete bunkers, and about the price of silence in a world ruled by paranoia. To understand how 5 young soldiers could vanish in plain sight, we have to go back to the early 1980s, an era when the Cold War wasn't just politics. It was everywhere, in the air you breathed, in the headlines of every newspaper, in the conversations whispered in kitchens late at night. By 1982, NATO and the Warsaw Pact stood toe-to-toe, 2 massive armies glaring at each other across a divided Europe. On one side, the United States, Britain, West Germany, France, and their allies. On the other, the Soviet Union and its Eastern Bloc states, Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Bulgaria. Each side armed to the teeth, each side convinced that the other might launch a strike at any moment. For ordinary people, the Cold War meant air raid drills, propaganda posters, and a constant low-level dread of nuclear war. But for soldiers, it meant endless exercises designed to prepare for a war that everyone hoped would never come. These war games were massive undertakings, tens of thousands of troops, hundreds of vehicles, and sprawling training grounds turned into mock battlefields. The particular exercise in which our 5 soldiers disappeared was officially described as a combined readiness drill. On paper, it was about practicing coordination between NATO units, making sure American tanks could work with German infantry, making sure British paratroopers could coordinate with French artillery. In reality, it was also about testing experimental tactics and equipment, some of which were never acknowledged publicly. The training grounds chosen for this drill were located in a dense European forest, far from civilian eyes. Imagine miles of woodland cut by narrow dirt roads dotted with bunkers and watchtowers. The nights were cold and damp, the kind of nights where mist creeps low between the trees and every snapped twig echoes like a gunshot. Soldiers lived in tents or in temporary wooden barracks, eating rations that tasted like cardboard and drinking coffee that was always lukewarm. But there was something unusual about this particular exercise. Veterans who participated later described sections of the training ground that were strictly off limits. Entire zones were cordoned off by barbed wire and patrolled by armed guards, even though this was supposed to be a NATO drill and all participants were allies. Some soldiers whispered about underground bunkers hidden beneath the forest. Others swore they saw unfamiliar equipment, strange antennae, radar dishes that hummed at night, vehicles with markings no one recognized. The Cold War was fertile ground for rumor, of course. Soldiers away from home, scared and bored, would spin stories about secret experiments, about energy weapons and psychological operations. But in this case, the rumors carried an unusual weight because within days, 5 men would vanish in that very environment. Who were these men? The records are patchy because NATO never officially released their names, but fragments leaked through: a 19-year-old private from Ohio, a 21-year-old German conscript, a British lance corporal who wrote letters to his fiancée back home, a young Canadian soldier whose parents would spend the rest of their lives demanding answers, and a Belgian communications specialist, the oldest of the group at just 24. Different backgrounds, different uniforms, different languages, but fate would tie them together forever. They weren't in a high-security unit. They weren't carrying secret documents. They were ordinary soldiers assigned to patrol a sector of the forest. Perimeter. They should have been safe. And yet, on that misty autumn night in 1982, they walked into the woods and never came out. To appreciate the paranoia of that time, you have to understand the atmosphere of the early 1980s. In 1981, Ronald Reagan had taken office in the United States, calling the Soviet Union an evil empire. Nuclear arsenals were growing on both sides. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. The Americans were deploying new missiles in Europe. Spy satellites tracked every move from the skies. Double agents lurked in embassies. Every soldier knew that if war broke out, they would be the first to die on the front lines of World War III. This paranoia infected everything, even military exercises. A simple drill could suddenly feel like the edge of Armageddon. And in that climate, when 5 soldiers vanished, the immediate assumption wasn't they got lost. It was something far darker. Had they defected to the Soviets? Had Soviet special forces infiltrated the exercise and kidnapped them? Or had NATO itself staged something that went terribly wrong? By the end of this introduction and background, the stage is set. 5 ordinary men caught in extraordinary circumstances. And the question that still lingers 40 years later: what really happened in those woods? The night was October 17th, 1982. The NATO exercise had been running for nearly a week. Soldiers were exhausted, their uniforms damp with days of mist and rain, their boots caked in mud. Morale was low but steady. Everyone was focused on the mission. The 5 soldiers in question had been assigned to a simple task: perimeter watch. They were stationed along a stretch of forest edge near a makeshift command post. Their job was to monitor movement, check patrol routes, and report any unusual activity over their radios. It was routine, almost boring. These were the kinds of assignments young privates often dreaded: long hours of silence broken only by static-filled transmissions. That night, however, something was different. Several witnesses would later claim that the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No birds, no rustling of animals, just silence, broken only by the occasional cough of a soldier or the distant hum of machinery from the main camp. A few men reported feeling a faint vibration under their boots, as though something massive was moving underground. Others swore they saw flashes of light deeper in the woods, brief unnatural glows that looked nothing like campfires or flares. At 23:17 hours, the patrol reported in as normal. "Sector clear," the Canadian soldier said over the radio. "All quiet out here." His voice was steady, routine. There was no hint of panic. 10 minutes later, their squad leader attempted to contact them again. No response. At first, it wasn't alarming. Radios often malfunctioned. Interference was common in the forest, especially with so much electronic equipment in use. But when 30 minutes passed with no response, and when another patrol reached their assigned post only to find it empty, the alarm bells began to ring. The helmets were found first, lined up neatly against a tree, as if someone had deliberately set them there. Their rifles were stacked nearby, muzzles pointing upward in the traditional fashion soldiers use when resting weapons. The radios were still present, one of them emitting faint static. But the men were gone, no sign of a struggle. No footprints leading away, no blood, nothing. Within minutes, the order went out. Search the woods. Dozens of soldiers swept through the area with flashlights and dogs. Helicopters were scrambled, their spotlights sweeping across the treetops. Every trail, every ditch, every thicket was combed through. But the forest seemed to swallow sound, light, and men whole. A sergeant later recalled, "It was as if they had been lifted straight out of their boots. One second they were there, and the next, they were gone. And we were standing there holding their gear, wondering if we were next." The dogs refused to track beyond a few meters. They would whine, pull back, and refuse to enter certain sections of the woods. Some handlers claimed the animals were reacting to high-pitched sounds inaudible to human ears. Others said the dogs simply sensed something unnatural. By dawn, the EE search had expanded across several square miles. Nothing, not a footprint, not a shred of fabric, not a broken branch. The 5 men had simply ceased to exist. When news of the disappearance spread through the camp, morale collapsed. Soldiers whispered about Soviet infiltration teams, elite Spetsnaz slipping past NATO defenses. Others muttered about underground tunnels, secret labs, or worse, experiments involving energy weapons. The strangest rumors came from those who claimed to have seen strange lights above the treetops that night. One French paratrooper swore he saw a triangular shape hovering silently before it vanished. A British tank crew reported hearing a low-frequency hum that rattled their steel hull. By the time the sun rose, the official story was already forming. 5 soldiers had gone missing under unknown circumstances. Within hours, senior NATO officials arrived on site. The area was sealed. Journalists were told nothing beyond an incident occurred during training. The soldiers were officially listed as missing in action, though no combat had taken place. The families of the men were contacted individually. They were told only that their sons or husbands had disappeared during a routine drill and that NATO was doing everything possible to locate them. No details, no explanations, just silence. Inside the chain of command, however, things were far more complicated. Reports from that night were inconsistent. Some officers described unusual interference on their radios. Others mentioned seeing classified equipment being moved out of the area immediately after the disappearance. Several junior officers noted that intelligence personnel, men in plain uniforms with no insignia, arrived almost instantly, as though they had been waiting for something to happen. And then, the strangest thing, all written reports from the immediate aftermath were later lost or sealed. When soldiers returned home after the exercise, they were ordered not to speak of the missing men. Official debriefings emphasized that nothing unusual had occurred. Anyone caught spreading rumors was threatened with disciplinary action. But stories still leaked. Letters were written. Journalists caught wind of 5 NATO soldiers who vanished in the woods. A few articles even made it to print in obscure local newspapers. But each time, the stories were quickly retracted, replaced with bland statements about exercise mishaps. One German newspaper published an article headlined, "Soldiers Lost in NATO Drill." Within 24 hours, the entire issue was pulled from circulation, and the editor publicly apologized for misreporting. Privately, he told colleagues that military officials had threatened his career if he pursued the story further. Back home, the families were desperate. Letters poured into military offices. "Where is my son? What happened that night? Why won't you tell us the truth?" One mother traveled all the way to Brussels to confront NATO representatives in person. She was turned away at the door. A father who worked as a police officer in Canada filed his own private investigation, only to find his access to records blocked at every turn. Decades later, relatives would recall the same thing. Silence. Endless, suffocating silence. Among soldiers, the disappearance became a kind of ghost story. Recruits were told, Don't wander too far into the forest, or you'll end up like the five. Veterans whispered that NATO had been experimenting with new forms of radar, or perhaps psychological warfare devices, and that the men had been accidental casualties. Some insisted the soldiers had stumbled into an area they weren't meant to. See, an underground installation, a secret convoy, or a classified experiment, and had been removed to keep the secret safe. Others leaned toward the supernatural. Stories circulated of phantom lights, distorted voices in the radio static, shadows moving where no one stood. The official files, of course, said nothing. Formally, the disappearance was treated as a training incident, but behind closed doors, military police interviewed dozens of witnesses. Those interviews, however, were never released. In fact, when Freedom of Information requests were filed years later, the response was always the same: no records found. Yet insiders insisted the records did exist, classified under operation names like Silent Forest or Echo Watch. But these were terms no ordinary soldier had ever heard before. By the mid-1980s, the 5 soldiers were officially declared dead, though no bodies had ever been found. Families received folded flags, medals, and compensation, but they never received closure. And that's where the story might have ended, lost to time, buried beneath bureaucracy and fear, if not for the events that would unfold decades later when CIA files began to leak. When 5 men disappear without a trace in the middle of a heavily guarded NATO exercise, the human mind immediately reaches for explanations. Soldiers, commanders, families, everyone needed a reason. And in the Cold War, explanations often came wrapped in paranoia. The first and most obvious theory was simple: Soviet involvement. In 1982, NATO commanders lived in constant fear of Soviet infiltration. The KGB and GRU, the Soviet Union's military intelligence, were known to run aggressive operations across Europe. Spies were everywhere: embassies, student exchanges, even inside NATO headquarters itself. To believe that a Soviet team might have penetrated a military exercise wasn't far-fetched. Whispers spread quickly among the soldiers. A Spetsnaz unit, Soviet special forces, had crossed the border under cover of darkness. Their mission? To snatch NATO soldiers, interrogate them, and expose weaknesses in alliance operations. The problem with this theory was logistics. The exercise was massive, crawling with thousands of NATO troops. Helicopters circled overhead, armored columns rumbled along the roads, watchtowers scanned the tree lines. Could Soviet operatives really have infiltrated so deeply without detection? Some argued yes. They pointed to Soviet training in deep cover operations. These weren't ordinary soldiers, they were ghosts. Men trained to disappear into forests, to move silently, to strike without leaving a trace. A NATO officer later said, "If anyone could have done it, it was Spetsnaz. But 5 men all at once? That felt like more than even they were capable of." And then there was the lack of evidence. No tracks, no broken foliage, no signs of struggle. Soviet units were skilled, but not magicians. Still, for many, the Soviet theory remained the most comfortable explanation. It fit the worldview of the Cold War. The enemy was always watching, always waiting. A darker possibility was raised by some within NATO itself. What if the men had defected? Desertion was rare but not unheard of during the Cold War. Young soldiers, disillusioned or fearful, sometimes ran across borders to escape service. Could these 5 have slipped away, choosing the East over the West? At first glance, it seemed plausible. They were from different countries, different backgrounds. Perhaps they had grievances. Perhaps they had been recruited secretly, promised safety and rewards in the Soviet bloc. But again, the details didn't add up. Their gear was left behind, neatly arranged, their radios and rifles abandoned. Who defects without a weapon, without supplies, without even boots? And how would 5 men from 5 different nations coordinate such a move? The defection theory quickly collapsed under its own weight. Another explanation whispered among officers and later echoed in declassified fragments was far more disturbing. What if the men weren't taken by the enemy at all? What if they were victims of their own side? Throughout the Cold War, NATO and the United States experimented with advanced technologies that were often kept secret even from allied governments. High-frequency radar, directed energy weapons, psychological warfare techniques. Some of these programs never saw the light of day. Soldiers at the exercise recalled unusual equipment near the disappearance site. Tall antennae with dish-like structures, vehicles with sealed compartments, power cables snaking into the ground. Officially, these were part of communications tests. Unofficially, no one knew. What if the soldiers had stumbled into a field test of an experimental system? A directed energy beam, a psychological weapon, something designed to disable or disorient. The neat arrangement of their equipment, helmets lined up, rifles stacked, suggested order, not chaos. Almost as if the men had calmly walked into something, compelled or lured. One fragment from a later released CIA file contained a chilling line. Personnel incident occurred during trials. 5 subjects extracted, not recoverable. The wording alone raised eyebrows. Extracted, not recoverable. It sounded less like an accident and more like an experiment gone wrong. The forest where the disappearance took place was rumored to contain a network of underground bunkers left over from World War II. Locals spoke of tunnels that stretched for miles, secret chambers built by the Nazis and later repurposed by NATO. Some believed the soldiers had stumbled into one of these places, perhaps a concealed entrance, perhaps a chamber that had been deliberately hidden. One German reservist claimed he saw armed guards moving unusual equipment into the forest days before the incident. Another swore he heard metallic clanging beneath his feet, as though heavy machinery operated underground. If true, could the soldiers have been pulled into a hidden bunker? Taken not by enemies, but by their own allies, or by something much stranger buried in the earth? When conventional explanations fail, the mind drifts into the extraordinary. Several soldiers reported strange lights in the sky that night. One described them as triangular, hovering silently. Another said they shimmered like heat haze, warping the air. The dogs that refused to track into the forest were cited as further evidence. Animals sense things humans cannot. Rumors of UFOs swirled through the ranks. After all, the Cold War was full of strange aerial sightings, many later attributed to secret aircraft tests. But some were never explained. And then there were the stranger stories. A Belgian soldier claimed to have heard voices in the static of his radio, voices calling his name, though no one else heard them. A British paratrooper later admitted that during the search he felt disoriented, as though the forest itself was shifting around him, trees rearranging, paths looping back on themselves. Were these hallucinations brought on by stress? Or was something more otherworldly at play? What united all these theories was the absence of answers. NATO never confirmed or denied any of them. Reports were buried, witnesses silenced, families left to wonder, and as the years passed, the mystery deepened. Theories multiplied: Soviet abduction, secret weapons, underground labs, even the paranormal, each one plausible in its own way, each one terrifying. But what was the truth? The answer would not begin to surface until decades later, when cracks appeared in the wall of secrecy. CIA files, once locked away, began to leak. Journalists, researchers, and families dug relentlessly. And in those fragments of declassified history, hints of the fate of the 5 soldiers began to emerge. For the 5 men who vanished in 1982, the silence that followed was almost worse than the disappearance itself. No trace, no explanation, no official recognition beyond vague words. But for their families, the nightmare was only beginning. The first letters in the weeks after the incident, families received carefully worded letters. Each one, typed on official letterhead, expressed deep regret and informed them that their sons or husbands were missing following an exercise incident. No further details, no mention of where, how, or why, just missing. A mother in Ohio held the letter in her hands and wept. Her son, just 19, had written days earlier about how cold the nights were in Europe, how he missed home-cooked meals, and how he'd be back by Christmas. Now the military told her he had vanished. She called the local base, then the Pentagon. Each time she was told the same thing: "The matter is classified, we cannot discuss details." A young fiancée in England waited at the docks for her fiancé's return. He had promised to take her to London after the exercise, to buy her a ring he couldn't afford before he left. Instead, she received a knock at the door from two uniformed men who offered condolences but no answers. The Canadian family's father, himself a police officer, tried to press for details. He filed requests, demanded access to the investigation, and even traveled to Ottawa to meet defense officials. They offered him coffee, kind words, and nothing more. The Belgian family struggled to even find someone willing to speak their language. When they did, they were handed a stack of papers full of blacked-out sections, lines of ink where sentences should have been. The German conscripts' parents, living in a small Bavarian village, said local officials avoided them entirely. Neighbors whispered, but no one knew the truth. Their son's name appeared briefly in a local newspaper before the article was mysteriously pulled from circulation. In every case, the message was the same: silence. Some families refused to accept it. They organized, wrote letters to NATO, headquarters in Brussels, to parliaments, to congressmen. They marched into offices with photographs of their sons and asked the same question: what happened? Behind closed doors, officials were polite but evasive. Ongoing investigation. Matters of national security. We cannot disclose further information at this time. At first, many families believed the military genuinely didn't know. But as months turned into years, and as more requests were denied, suspicion grew. What were they hiding? By the mid-1980s, whispers began to circulate beyond the barracks. Families started receiving anonymous calls. Some said the soldiers had been taken by Soviet forces. Others hinted they had been caught up in a NATO experiment gone wrong. One widow in Belgium received a letter postmarked from East Berlin. It contained only a single sentence: "Your husband is alive, but not where you think." The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible. Investigators dismissed it as a cruel hoax, but she held on to it for the rest of her life. Another family in Canada claimed a man in a trench coat approached them after a public memorial service. He told them to stop asking questions before disappearing into the crowd. Were these genuine warnings, or just the tricks of a cruel world that preyed on grief? The families never knew. What united them all was absence. Empty chairs at tomb, family dinners, birthdays missed, letters that never arrived. A mother in Ohio kept her son's room exactly as it was in 1982. Posters still hung on the wall, his football jacket draped over a chair, his dog tags on the nightstand. For 40 years, she dusted the room every week, waiting for a knock on the door that never came. The British fiancé eventually married someone else, but she admitted to friends that she kept her former lover's photograph hidden in a drawer, unable to let go. The German parents built a small shrine in their garden, a wooden cross surrounded by flowers. Neighbors often found them there at dusk, holding hands in silence. The Canadian father turned his frustration into obsession. He collected every scrap of information he could find: maps of the training grounds, copies of newspaper clippings, interviews with other veterans. His basement became a war room of its own, papers tacked to walls, red string connecting theories. His wife begged him to let it go, but he couldn't. "If our son's body is out there, I will find it," he told her. In the late 1980s, some of the families began corresponding. A mother in Belgium wrote to a father in Canada. A widow in England contacted the German parents. Soon, letters were traveling across oceans, handwritten testimonies of grief, hope, and suspicion. Together, they decided to petition NATO directly. They drafted a formal request for information, signed by all 5 families, and delivered it in person to Brussels. The response was swift but chilling. Within days, each family received a visit from officials. They were reminded that the incident was a matter of international security and warned that pressing further could have serious consequences. One father later admitted he was threatened with losing his military pension if he continued. Another was told bluntly, "The best way to honor your son is to stop asking questions." Time did not dull the pain. If anything, it sharpened it. Every anniversary brought renewed headlines in small local papers, renewed grief, renewed silence. By the 1990s, some family members had passed away without answers. Graves were dug not for the missing men, but for their parents, who died still wondering what happened. Others kept fighting. The Canadian father continued writing to officials even into his 70s. The British fiancée, now a grandmother, still spoke of her lost love in interviews. For many, the mystery became a curse. Villagers near the training ground spoke of strange happenings long after 1982. Hikers claimed to hear voices in the mist. Hunters swore their dogs refused to enter certain parts of the forest. Soldiers stationed nearby told tales of the five who vanished. Their story passed down like folklore. For the families, these rumors were both a comfort and a torment. They proved the world hadn't forgotten, but they also kept reopening wounds that never healed. Then, in the early 2000s, everything began to change. Freedom of information laws in the United States, Britain, and Canada led to the slow release of Cold War files. Most were dull: budget reports, logistics memos, routine surveillance data. But buried among them were fragments that hinted at something darker. CIA documents referencing incident at exercise site, NATO memos about loss of personnel, classified circumstances, reports that certain areas of the forest had been sealed permanently after 1982. For the families, this was proof they had been right all along. The truth had been buried, and as journalists and researchers picked up the trail, the silence began to crack. For nearly 2 decades, the story of the 5 missing soldiers remained buried under silence, threats, and official denials. Families grew old without answers. Soldiers who had been there that night carried secrets they were forbidden to share. The forest itself became just another patch of land in Europe, its dark past hidden from view. But in the early 2000s, everything began to change. In 2002, a Canadian journalist named David Keller filed a Freedom of Information request with the U.S. Department of Defense. He had heard whispers about an incident during a NATO exercise in 1982 and wanted to confirm whether anything unusual had taken place. The response was brief, almost dismissive. No records located. But Keller was persistent. He filed again, this time with slightly altered wording, and then again and again. After 2 years of rejections, he finally received something unexpected: a packet of heavily redacted documents, more black ink than words. One page, however, contained a phrase that electrified him: exercise silent forest, 5 personnel unaccounted for, classified investigation, files transferred to Langley, the headquarters of the CIA. If NATO had turned the files over to the CIA, that meant the disappearance wasn't just a training accident. It had become intelligence. Around the same time in Washington, D.C., a researcher combing through Cold War archives stumbled upon another strange reference. It was buried in a box of declassified communications, a memo dated 1983 mentioning continuing analysis of unexplained personnel loss, exercise site. Though vague, the language was unusual. Military reports typically referred to casualties, accidents, or desertions, not unexplained personnel loss. Word began to spread among researchers, journalists, and conspiracy theorists alike. The case of the vanished 5 was real, and then came the first leak. In 2005, an anonymous envelope arrived at Keller's office in Toronto. Inside were photocopies of documents stamped secret. They contained fragments of after-action reports, radio transcripts, and chilling handwritten notes. One page read, "Personnel extracted under anomalous conditions. Recommend classification indefinite." Another mentioned interference with communications equipment and psychological disorientation of search teams. Most disturbing was a sketch, an outline of the forest clearing where the soldiers' equipment had been found, with a large circle drawn around the spot. Inside the circle, someone had scrawled the words, "Field of Effect." When Keller published his findings, the families of the missing men reacted with a mix of hope and fury. For decades, they had been told nothing. Now, finally, evidence suggested there had been more to the story. The Canadian father, by then an old man in failing health, told reporters, They knew all along. My boy didn't just disappear. They took him, or they let something take him. The Ohio mother wept on camera, clutching her son's photograph. I always said he wouldn't just run away. They tried to make me believe. He deserted, but now I know they lied. NATO officials refused to comment. The CIA, when pressed, issued a short statement. We do not confirm or deny details regarding historical operations. But the story had broken open. Independent. Researchers began chasing the trail. They scoured declassified files, military logs, even local police reports from villages near the training ground. One German historian uncovered a curious fact. In October 1982, villagers living near the forest reported unusual activity. Trucks moved in and out at night. Roads were sealed off. Some claimed they saw men in unmarked uniforms carrying crates into the woods. Another researcher discovered that parts of the forest had been declared restricted military zones years after the exercise ended, despite having no obvious strategic purpose. To this day, some of those areas remain off limits. A British journalist even tracked down a retired NATO officer who had been there the night the soldiers vanished. After a long pause, the officer said only one thing before hanging up the phone. What happened there wasn't natural, and we were told to shut up about it. By 2010, pressure was mounting. Activists and families filed coordinated freedom of information requests. Lawsuits were launched. Politicians were questioned. Slowly, reluctantly, the CIA began to release small fragments of information. The files painted a disturbing picture. One declassified report, dated November 1982, described phenomena observed during exercise resulting in loss of personnel. Another spoke of classified technologies under evaluation. Most shocking was a document marked "not for release" that had been mistakenly included in a declassification packet. It read, "Incident resulted in permanent loss of 5 NATO personnel. No remains recoverable. Psychological effects observed in search units. Strong recommendation: restrict further exercises in sector. Subject requires continued monitoring." The phrase, "no remains recoverable," sent chills through anyone who read it. What could that possibly mean? Were the men disintegrated, taken, transported elsewhere? Another file referred cryptically to foreign interference unconfirmed. Was this a reference to the Soviets? Or something else entirely? As the CIA files trickled out, old theories came roaring back with new force. Supporters of the Soviet theory argued that the foreign interference note was proof of a KGB operation. They suggested the men had been captured and held in secret until their deaths. Others pointed to the classified technologies phrase. Maybe the soldiers had wandered into an experiment involving electromagnetic fields, disorientation devices, or worse, something that erased them. And then there were the paranormal enthusiasts. For them, the "no remains recoverable" line was evidence of something extraordinary, an encounter with forces beyond human comprehension. In 2014, another breakthrough came. A British investigative journalist named Sarah Whitman obtained access to a retired CIA analyst. Over tea in a quiet London cafe, the analyst hinted at what he knew. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time, he said softly. There was a field test, something experimental. It went off the rails. The men didn't die, at least, not in the way you think. They were removed. When pressed on what removed meant, he refused to elaborate. He only said, "That forest should have been left alone, but governments never leave things alone." For the families, these revelations were bittersweet. They confirmed that something had happened, something real, something the authorities had hidden. But they still offered no closure. The British fiancée, now in her 60s, said in an interview, "All I want is the truth. I don't care if it's ugly. I just want to know what happened to the man I loved." The German parents had passed away by then, never knowing. The Canadian father died clutching his files, his basement war room still plastered with maps and documents. But younger relatives, children, nieces, nephews, took up the fight. They demanded full disclosure. They wanted the world to know the truth. And yet, even with leaks, redactions, and whispered confessions, the most crucial details remain locked away. Pages are still blacked out. Witnesses still refuse to talk. The forest remains restricted. One thing is certain: the CIA knows more than it admits. The question is, why won't they tell? Was it Soviet infiltration? A NATO experiment gone wrong? Something paranormal that defies explanation? The files don't say. Or perhaps they say too much, hidden beneath the layers of black ink. The most haunting detail came from a single page released in 2017. It was marked declassified in part. At the top was a short paragraph. 5 NATO personnel vanished. October 17, 1982. Equipment recovered. Remains unrecoverable. Event classified as Phenomenon 87B. Continued monitoring required. No further exercises authorized in sector. Phenomenon 87B. No one outside the intelligence community knows what that phrase means. To this day, researchers argue whether it was code for a Soviet weapon, a scientific anomaly, or something far stranger. But for the families, it was one more piece of proof. Their loved ones had not been forgotten. Their fate had not been ignored. They were part of something bigger, something so secret, so terrifying, that even 4 decades later, the truth could not be spoken aloud. 4 decades after the disappearance, the forest where the 5 soldiers vanished remains as silent as ever. The trees have grown taller, the paths overgrown, but the weight of mystery lingers in the air. To most passers-by, it's just another woodland. But to those who know the story, it's a place haunted by unanswered questions. In the 2010s, a new generation of researchers took up the cause. Equipped with technology unthinkable in 1982, drones, ground-penetrating radar, electromagnetic sensors, they sought to uncover what NATO and the CIA had tried to bury. Team of independent investigators from Germany managed to secure permission to conduct surveys in the outskirts of the restricted zone. Their radar scans revealed anomalies beneath the soil, long metallic shapes consistent with underground tunnels. Some appeared to run directly beneath the site where the soldiers' equipment was recovered. Another group from Britain flew thermal drones over the forest at night. To their astonishment, they detected areas of heat far below the surface, as though machinery were still running underground, decades after the exercise supposedly ended. When asked to comment, NATO officials simply repeated, "No operations currently take place in the sector." But the images told another story. Not all the investigators were military historians or scientists. Paranormal research groups flocked to the forest too, drawn by the tales of strange lights, static on radios, and dogs refusing to enter. One French team set up cameras and audio recorders overnight. In the early hours of the morning, their devices captured faint voices, 5 distinct voices muttering in English, German, and French. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably human. Another group claimed that their electromagnetic sensors spiked violently near the clearing. Batteries drained, cameras shut down, and one investigator collapsed briefly, claiming he felt pulled downward, as though the ground itself wanted to swallow him. Skeptics dismissed these as tricks of the imagination, the mind imposing patterns on noise. But for believers, it was evidence that the 5 soldiers never truly left, that something of them still lingered, trapped between worlds. By now, the original parents had passed away. The mothers and fathers who had once begged for answers were gone, but their children, nieces, and nephews carried the torch. The Canadian soldier's younger sister, now a retired teacher, began organizing annual memorials. She invited journalists, veterans, and locals to gather at the edge of the forest, lighting candles for the 5 men. The Ohio mother's granddaughter created an online archive, digitizing every article, every document, every rumor. She called it the Forgotten 5 Project. Today, it serves as the central hub for anyone researching the case. The British fiancé's son, born years after his mother lost her fiancé, became a lawyer. He now files legal challenges on behalf of the families, demanding full release of the CIA files. "My mother lost her future," he told a reporter. "I won't let the truth die with her." The case has also drawn attention from universities. Scholars in sociology, psychology, and history study it as an example of Cold War secrecy. A professor in Belgium published a paper arguing that the disappearance was less about the soldiers themselves and more about how governments manipulate truth. He wrote, "In the Cold War, people did not simply vanish. Records vanished, words vanished, and with them, accountability." Another researcher in Canada compared the case to other mysterious disappearances in military history. The lost patrols of World War I, the vanished submarines of the Cold War. She noted eerie similarities. Equipment left neatly behind, official silence, whispers of experiments. Despite decades passing, parts of the forest remain off-limits. Signs warn of unexploded ordnance, but locals are skeptical. They say the real reason is to keep people away from whatever lies underground. Satellite images show fenced areas, patrol tracks, even the occasional unmarked vehicle entering late at night. Officially, these are forestry operations. Unofficially, no one knows. One hiker who strayed too close reported being confronted by men in plain clothes. They asked no questions, simply escorted him back to the road. "They knew exactly why I was there," he later said, "and they didn't need to explain." With technology advancing, theories about what really happened have grown more elaborate. Some insist the men were taken into an underground facility and subjected to experiments, tests of human endurance, psychological manipulation, or exposure to new weapons. Others believe the forest itself hides a natural anomaly, some kind of geomagnetic disturbance capable of disorienting or even transporting those who enter. And then there are those who lean toward the paranormal. They suggest the soldiers stumbled into a rift, a tear in reality, slipping into another dimension or timeline. None of these theories can be proven, but each is supported by fragments, whispers, and unanswered questions. In 2019, another wave of Freedom of Information requests was filed. Once again, fragments trickled out, redacted memos, vague reports. One file contained a chilling line: "Monitoring continues. No further incursions authorized." Another referred to Phenomenon 87B again, describing it as stable but unpredictable. To this day, the CIA has never explained what Phenomenon 87B means. Families believe it's the key to the mystery, the classification given to whatever swallowed the 5 men in 1982. Beyond the theories and the files, the true tragedy lies with the human beings. 5 men, barely out of youth, sent to train. In the name of alliance defense, they expected to go home. They expected to live their lives. Instead, they vanished into silence. Their families aged without them. Their children were never born. Their futures were erased, and yet their absence shaped lives. The Canadian father's obsession inspired a new generation of researchers. The British fiancé's grief became a story passed down to her grandchildren. The Ohio mother's fight turned into an online archive that connects people across the globe. The soldiers are gone, but their story lives, carried by those unwilling to forget. Today, the forest stands quiet, leaves rustle, birds sing. But those who walk among the trees often describe a feeling, an unnatural stillness, a weight pressing down, as if the air itself remembers. Some say, if you stand in the clearing at night, you'll hear voices. Some say you'll feel watched. Some claim they've seen shapes moving between the trees, shadows that don't belong. Maybe it's imagination, maybe it's the echo of history, or maybe it's something else, something the CIA still watches 4 decades later. The truth of what happened in 1982 may never be known. The CIA will not speak. NATO denies involvement. Families still fight. Researchers still dig. But one fact remains. 5 soldiers vanished into thin air, and 40 years later, the world still doesn't know why, and perhaps that's the most terrifying part. 40 years have passed since the night 5 young soldiers vanished in a European forest. Their names have faded from official records. Their faces appear only in yellowed photographs tucked away in drawers. Yet their story endures, not because governments wanted it remembered, but because families refused to forget. From the very beginning, the silence was louder than any answer could have been. Families received vague letters. Officers avoided eye contact. Questions were met with the same empty phrase, "The matter is classified." But silence has its own power. It tells us what words cannot. And in this case, the silence told families one truth: something had gone terribly wrong. Imagine being a mother who never sees her son come home. Every knock at the door fills you with hope, only to crush you with disappointment. Imagine being a father who spends his final years surrounded by maps, clippings, and red strings, chasing a truth the world has hidden. Imagine being a young woman who waits at the docks for her fiancé, only to live the rest of her life with an empty space in her heart. The story of the five is not just about what happened in 1982. It's about what happened every year after, in the homes and hearts of those left behind. The declassified documents gave us glimpses, but never the full picture. Phenomenon 87B, no remains recoverable. Psychological effects observed in search teams. Each phrase is a door, but one that opens only a crack. Enough to terrify, never enough to explain. Why was the CIA involved in what should have been a routine training exercise? Why do parts of the forest remain sealed to this day? And what does no remains recoverable really mean? These questions hang over the story like a fog, thick, suffocating, and impossible to disperse. Over the years, theories have multiplied. Some say the men were captured by Soviet operatives. Others believe they were victims of a secret NATO experiment gone wrong. Still others whisper of natural anomalies, rifts in reality, places where physics bends and people disappear. None of these theories can be proven, but none can be disproven either. That uncertainty is what keeps the story alive. Walk into the forest now, and you'll find quiet paths, tangled branches, and an eerie calm. But those who know the story say the air feels heavy, charged. Birds fall silent. Dogs refuse to enter. Equipment malfunctions. Maybe it's coincidence, or maybe the forest remembers. One hiker swears he saw 5 figures standing at the edge of the clearing. When he blinked, they were gone. Another claims he heard distant voices speaking English where no one should have been. Are these hallucinations born of fear? Or are they echoes of the men who never came home? In the end, what matters most is not whether the truth points to Soviet spies, CIA experiments, or paranormal phenomena. What matters is the cost. 5 young men were lost. Their families were condemned to decades of grief. And governments, those who swore to protect them, chose silence over truth. History is filled with stories like this. Stories where the lives of ordinary people are erased in the shadows of power. Stories where secrets matter more than human suffering. But what makes this story different is you. Because by listening, by remembering, you are ensuring these men are not erased. The 5 who vanished in 1982 are not just victims of one night. They are warnings across time. Warnings about the cost of secrecy. Warnings about the fragility of truth. Warnings about how quickly human beings can be swallowed by silence. As long as their story is told, the warning remains. And now, after 40 years, their story has reached you. Somewhere across the world, in your home, through your screen, their voices have traveled further than they ever could have imagined. If you've made it this far, you are part of the chain. You've carried their memory one step further into the future. But memory is fragile. It fades unless we guard it. That's why I ask you, not as an entertainer, but as a fellow traveler through these stories, help keep this memory alive. Like this video so the story spreads. Subscribe so you'll hear the next forgotten truth we uncover. And comment below. Tell me where you're watching from and what you think happened in that forest. Your words matter. Your presence matters. Because together, we make sure silence does not win. Picture it, a dark forest, mist curling. Between the trees, a clearing where 5 young men once stood, unaware of what awaited them. Their laughter, their footsteps, their very existence, gone in an instant. But tonight, you heard their story. You carried their voices in your mind, and as long as even one person remembers, they are not truly gone.